I want to remind, oh, great. Sorry, I totally forgot about recording. Thank you, whoever did it. A few links that I want to share with you. The presentation is available, so you can take a look at each link. But one thing I want to remind everybody, personally speaking, I am a former international student, went through the job search process. So things that I want to remind everybody, sometimes there might be cultural differences, not necessarily you don't want people to perceive you like weird behavior, right? For example, there might be conflicting values. Certain cultures may really value about the teamwork. And then here in the United States, it's very much focused on you as an individual. And sometimes even in our vocabulary, I think in a collective culture, I tend to say we all the time. But in the United States, especially in the job search process and interview process, employer want to hear you as an individual, what you have accomplished. Eye contact is another thing. Some of the cultures, you know, may some people not feeling comfortable just because the culture differences, it's the gender difference, the seniority, so the seniority as well. So pay attention to those culture difference. One key question I think a lot of you may ask, at what point as international students that I should let employer know I am international students in F1, you know, or J1 status, so making them be aware. My personal view on this is always first and foremost, focus on the skill set you have rather than your immigration status. You know, I know you're all anxious letting them know, so you want to know whether they're going to process your H-1B, et cetera, et cetera. Now, keep in mind, it's illegal any employer to ask you for your immigration status, okay? Whether I should say, ask your citizenship, okay? So I would always say, save this question at the very end, once you had a chance to share with your employer the skill set, the knowledge, experience, everything you had, and then ask a very question at the very end and bring them to the awareness, you know, you have the work authorization to work, but what's going to be the process getting you employment authorization. Interview fashion and grooming tips, this is important as well. Even though this is a virtual environment, doing virtual interview, I would still emphasize this is a still key point, even though they can only see you, you know, with a limited view access, but you only have one chance to impress your employer. I always say that. This is your only one chance. You want to impress them, making sure you dress professionally. University Career Center has a lot of resources as well. The last website, it's wonderful in the sense is sometimes you find maybe a volunteer position on campus, you know, not paid. You might be disappointed, you know, you wish it is a paid position. But however, I always want to say it is a maybe unpaid position, but the job, the skills and experience is more important than later on, maybe when the professor has funding available, they can pay you. But it's really important what you can gain through this experience rather than just getting the paid. Of course, ideally getting paid, that would be wonderful. So I want to share those 4 links with everybody as well. The last resources I want to share with people is really English language resources. The Sweetland Center for Writing are wonderful resources. You have not utilized them. I would strongly encourage you to check out both websites because they do advising, writing workshops. We also have the H-1B workshop in November and employment-based, the U.S. permanent residency information. It's the PR workshop. Both H-1B and PR workshop will be presented by immigration attorney in a very elaborate, detailed information. Today will be a very quick overview. So I want you to save the date for now. We will also announce those workshops in a future newsletter as well. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. I will let Mariella to share her screen with everybody.
Thank you, Kate. Can you see the screen all right?
Yes.
Beautiful. So
Yes.
First of all, thank you for the opportunity to join you today. I am very excited to share some tips with you for some effective strategies that you can use to put together a job search in the United States. As Kate mentioned, I work in the U of M University Career Center, and when things are normal, we are just a couple of floors above the International Center. We are located in the Student Activities Building. But like most of you and most of campus, we're working remotely at this time. All right. What I would like to start with today is just to quickly cover some major resources that are available to all of you. And I will not click on every single site that we provide in the presentations. We figure you can do that at your leisure, but I do want to highlight a few things. Some of the main offices that are here on campus available to assist you are, of course, the International Center, but also the Career Services Office in your own school or college. U of M, being the large campus that it is, has multiple career services. Some of these offices only serve the students in that particular school or college, like engineering or business. But our office that's why it's called University Career Center, serves students across all schools and colleges. But that also means that we are generalists. We are not specialists. We know about a lot of things, but for some, specialty conversations, the practitioners in your own school or college may be a better resource for you. The Career Center has a bunch of general resources on what you may expect when it comes on resume writing, cover letter, interview preparation, job search. But I want to draw your attention to this page that I maintain on our site, which is just resources, as the name implies, for international students. You will find anything from adjusting to U.S. language and culture, getting involved in campus, improving your business English, to a lot of articles and resources and mechanisms to support your resume writing, cover letter, networking, interviews, volunteering, and internship. There's also a specific section, as you can see, that is devoted to job searching in the coronavirus era. Because as you know, right now, we are not necessarily operating under normal circumstances. I will come back to some of these resources later, but I wanted to give you a general flavor of what you may find in there. And then you will find resources both for conducting a job search here in the US, but also for conducting a more global job or internship search. And finally, because we know that not all of you are necessarily thinking job or internship as your next step, but you're considering graduate or professional school, there are also some resources both for graduate school in general to pursue the degree, as well as professional schools such as law school, medical school, dental schools, and the like. All right. I guess the first key message that I need to share today is that job searching is so much more than just writing a resume and sending it out to a gazillion of employers, okay? I'm not saying that that's a bad thing to do, quite the opposite, but it should only be one of the very many ways that you approach your job search, because anything that you see posted on a job board is seen by hundreds, thousands of other people. So it can be tough for your application to bubble up to the top. So then if it's not just about writing a resume and sending it to a lot of employers, what should a job search entail? This is my sort of four-step approach. I believe that any effective job search starts with you knowing yourself and knowing what you're looking for. It's really hard to find something if you don't know what you are looking for. And don't worry, I will dive into any of these points in the following slides and provide some resources. But right now, let's look at a high level. What does it mean to put together an effective job search? It means that you need to know yourself. But if you're conducting a job search here in the US, it also means that you need to understand the business and cultural norms that apply to conducting a job search in this country. You need to understand what are the employer expectations. And I know this is hard to hear, but you also need to develop an understanding, if not an appreciation, for why employers may be resistant to hiring international students. You also need to develop job and internship search materials. Think resumes, cover letters, and preparation. Think interviews that fit the particular segment of the job market that you are pursuing. And then you need to remember that every plan falls flat if it's not appropriately executed. And that for anyone, I mean, it is tough for a domestic student to look for a job. Of course, international students face additional difficulties, but persevering is key. But along with perseverance, it's also very important that you have and that you develop alternate plans as well. Because as much as everyone would like to secure those kind of position, it may not work out for everyone. There is an expression in English. Are you familiar with the expression, don't kill the ambassador? Meaning that some things are not fun to hear. So right now, please don't kill the ambassador. But I do have a professional responsibility to say, not everything may work out based on your dreams and plans. So it's important that you also develop an alternate or parallel plan, whether it is conducting a job search in your home country or elsewhere, to make sure that at the end of your U of M degree, you are, you can have career satisfaction. But let's go now into these points one by one. What does it mean to know yourself? When you start a job search, you are pretty much, you almost need to consider yourself as a product. You're trying to sell yourself. And when you're selling a product, you need to be able to identify the characteristics and the benefits of that product to be purchased, acquired by your audience. So you need to be able to have a keen awareness of both your strengths and your weaknesses. Your strengths, because this is what you want to play up in your search. What are your assets? By your weaknesses as well, so that you can find ways to address them, to minimize them. You also need to be able to articulate what can you do for an employer? What kind of problems can you help them solve? And especially in which industry or through what function? And there is a fundamental difference between industry and function. So allow me here to stop for a second. You might be interested in, I don't know, finance, right? But finance could be, working in banking or investment, but also every large corporation, automotive, software company, manufacturing are going to have a financial branch. That's the function. So a mistake that I commonly see in international students, especially when they're looking at, job fairs and the like, they are looking mostly for industries, but you need to understand also what kind of job function are you trying to pursue, because you might be able to find that function in an industry that you would have otherwise neglected to consider, if it makes any sense. It will be very important that you understand your work authorization, that you know the rules that apply to your visa. Because let's face it, you cannot expect your employers to know those terms and to know those rules. And so it will be very important that you work closely with the International Center and the advisors there to understand both when you can and cannot do with your type of visa, and that you understand both the limitations and the powers of the visa that you hold. And then lastly, I would say it's important that you know that you need to start early. Under general circumstances, domestic students usually take 6 to 9 months to secure a position. Even though we do not have data for 2020 yet, I think it's safe to assume that most people are gonna take longer than 6 to 9 months, and that might be particularly true for you as an international student. I promised you that in addition to steps, I would share some examples of resources that you can utilize to meet this goal. So for example, in terms of knowing yourself and knowing what you're looking for, here are some ideas. To know yourself, not that every single one of you has to do this, but if you have trouble conducting self-assessment, please be aware that the Career Center offers a number of assessment tools. Two in particular, I would bring to your attention the Strong Interest Inventory and particularly the Clifton Strengths. There is a small fee associated with these tests because we have to send them out. But then the meeting, the one-on-one with a career coach, all of that is free because of your standing as a U of M student or recent alum. For example, the Clifton Strengths really helps you become more keenly aware of what your strengths are, and those could be what you may wish to play up during your job search. If you're not clear where you would like to apply your skills, the Strong Interest Inventory can align your interests, not your aptitudes, your interest, with those of people that are happy in those fields, that feel realized in those fields. So those career assessment tools might be something that some of you may want to consider. In order to understand the job market and the world of work here in the US, I'm pointing you out to two of many, many resources out there. Let's look for, Vault and ONET. ONET covers every single possible position that you can find in the United States. And what I like about it, let's say, for example, that you want to be an, aerospace engineer. Here it is. It will give you various titles where aerospace engineers may be found, and a lot of information about the tasks and the skills required in those roles, the level of education that you need, what are some typical work activities, what level of education you may need, salary expectations. Is a great tool. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but it's a great tool to help you learn more about specific roles. Especially for undergraduate students. Oops, sorry, I would like to make you aware of career tracks. Career tracks are general fields that in very common fields among our U of M undergraduate students. And this is why we have created these tracks. These are not majors. You can choose and pick however many you like. And after you explore them, you decide they're not for you, you can just unjoin them. But through your Handshake account, there are instructions down here on how to join them. You can pick one or more: consulting, data science, health, law, marketing, whatever the case may be. And by joining them, you will start receiving periodical newsletters that alert you to articles, resources, upcoming events relevant to and job opportunities. Did I mention that? That are relevant to your career interest. Okay, so career tracks really nice resource for many of you. And then, of course, we've spoken about the importance of learning the ins and outs of your visa. And you can, of course, extrapolate that and learn that both from the International Center site and by working with the international advisors there. Let me take a little sip of water here. So, number 2, here we underscore the importance of understanding the U.S. job market, potential employers' objections to hiring international students, as well as employer expectations and cultural norms. One thing that sometimes it's hard for someone who started their education in another country is to understand that grades alone are not enough here in the US to secure a job. Don't read me wrong, good grades are great and they are a wonderful introduction in your interaction with an employers, but by themselves, they're not enough to make you attractive. Employers also want to make sure that you have some relevant experience in those fields, and that experience may be reached through classroom projects, through volunteer opportunities, ideally through work if you have some previous work experience, and any other kind of co-curricular engagement you may be involved in, let's say research, for example. You will see that although employers in different industries have maybe some specific expectations, there are some, they call them career readiness skills, and we'll talk about those in a second. There are certain things that they expect from anyone, no matter what kind of positions they're pursuing. The other thing that is important to understand is that this is not a country where there are placement bureaus, where someone is going to match a candidate with an opening, okay? You have to be the actor of this approach, of this endeavor. It's up to you to be your own advocate. It's up to you to take the initiative, and especially it's up to you to build your own professional network. And rest assured that I will give you some ideas of how you can do that. But I just want to underscore the point that you should be the #1 agent of your job search, because no one else can do it for you. And finally, it's very important that you understand at least the fundamentals of business education and professional etiquette. There are some things in the world of, US employers that maybe go, how can I say, unmentioned because some people take them for granted. But things like dressing professionally for interaction, punctuality. I cannot tell you what sticklers Americans are when it comes to punctuality. And you saw from the little exchange, I'm originally from Italy, Italians, but I know a lot of people in other culture have a very loose sense of time. And it's perfectly acceptable to show up a few minutes late. It's perfectly acceptable to sit next close to a person. I'm a counselor. Believe it or not, one of the first things that I needed to learn was not to sit so close to my clients, which of course were mostly, US students, because I would push my chair next to them and they would go, whoa, I just entered their personal sphere. Those are things that no one is going to maybe spell out for you, but if you observe and you look, you can understand what are those things that you need to consider. For example, not respecting people's times. If you have an half-hour appointment, when you're approaching half hour, start wrapping up the conversation. Show respect for the employer's time or whoever is giving you an informational interview to know that time is up. Okay, these are what I mean by understand U.S. business fundamentals in terms of, communication and professional etiquette. If someone sends you a message, respond promptly, use good grammar, don't send them 2 pages worth of questions because people are busy and Americans value what? There? If this was a live program, I would like to hear a chorus of saying time. Okay, let me take a little detour here. But when I said before, please develop at least a basic understanding, if not sympathy, as to why Americans may be, US employers may be resistant to hiring international students. Some of their companies simply do not allow them to hire international students, especially in state and government, defense, and industries like that. I often hear students saying, I'm only looking for, a site where to do my OPT. I don't need sponsorship. Why employers will not consider me? You have to understand that a lot of employers utilize internships, externships, practicums as a way to preview a long-term employee. So if they know from the get-go that their organization will not allow them to hire an international student, they're not as likely to consider that individual for OPT because they know that they wouldn't be able to hire them on the other side of the experience. And, for H-1B positions, there are application and fees that organizations may or may not be willing to pay, and other constraints that John, Kate, and my colleagues in the International Center can address more aptly than I can. But just I was trying to say it's not out of meanness, it's not out of xenophobia, it's just the reality of what the market is. But what are some of the resources that you can use to engage, develop some experience, and become more career ready for your interactions with employers? For example, did you know that U of M has over 1,600 student organizations? Okay? Please take advantage of them. Find organizations not only where you can find people perhaps from your country with whom you share, some cultural values and awareness. Also look for organizations that have a certain professional focus, because it's so important to rub elbows with people that share your professional goals. And so it's just, you can do a search by name, different categories. What do I have here? If you have interest in law, you can find what the pre-law societies are and reach out to them and see what it would take to go to their meetings and become a member. If you're looking for non-work study campus jobs, here is a link where you can find about them. Remember when before I was talking about how employers will have certain expectations for certain skills and traits that may be specific to their industry, but fundamentally they're all aiming for certain career readiness competencies. The number one is critical thinking and problem solving. Look at number two, please, oral, written, and communication. That's a crucial one. Teamwork, collaboration, and the list goes on. And it's not enough to be able to say, I'm a good team player. You need to be able to accrue enough experiences in the classroom and outside of the classroom that will allow you to make a case to demonstrate that indeed you are a good team player. And you can also use this career readiness list, almost like a checklist of things that you feel like these are some areas that I need to work on. And these are perhaps some membership, affiliations, volunteer opportunities that I need to pursue to be able to grow in those areas. Now, how should you build your professional network? I'm sure most of you are familiar with LinkedIn, and I encourage you to tap it as much as possible. Here you get a link to it, but I want to take a moment to talk to you about U.Can, which is, imagine is U.Can, but for U of M, it's like a LinkedIn for U of M students. What I like about U.Can is that all of you already have an account that you just have to activate as a U of M student or alum. You can browse who is in the system, and you can browse by an organization name or a field or a school. And then based on who comes up, so you want to search for, I don't know, I'm going to say either in general finance, and we can come up with 608, maybe too many. Let's narrow the search to just give me a second. Financial analyst. Okay, 60, a lot more manageable. And so you can look at the profile of those people who came up. They may have been a financial analyst in a previous internship or in their current job, who knows. Regardless, they've had some exposure to that role. And if you find some profiles that align with your interest, you can ask them to connect with you. And without having to share phone numbers or email addresses, you can schedule a time during which you can conduct informational interviews. Informational interviews are different from job interviews. During job interviews, you're actually vying for a job, but that happens later. In most cases, you need to start with informational interviews where you gather insights about the role, about the organization, about the position, and think about, where does your organization post openings? How did you secure your job? What should I know if I want to do something like this? And of course, you can also search by organization name. So think of U.Can as a LinkedIn specific to U of M, and as such, you are a lot more likely to hear back. I'm not saying that you should do U.Can over LinkedIn. I'm saying you should do both. But U.Can may be a safer place to start because at least you're sharing that U of M background. Handshake is the recruitment platform that the Career Center uses and that you can use from anything from scheduling an appointment with one of us, with a career coach, to seeing what kind of upcoming events we have, to see who's recruiting right now, U of M students, to see job postings. And if you're not quite sure how to use Handshake, you can actually schedule an appointment. And one of the appointment types is just an introduction to Handshake. So I would encourage you to do that so that you can make the most of those resources available to you. Again, I'm not going through every single resource, but you can explore them there at your leisure. And then there's the issue of developing materials that are appropriate for the type of position that you are pursuing. I cannot stress the importance of developing resumes or CVs and ensuing cover letters that are targeted to a specific industry or function. Because a generic resume is not going to bubble up to the top. It's not going to fit employer needs 100%. It will also be important for you to understand how applicant tracking systems work, and I will give you some resources to do that, because especially right now in this COVID era, employers were using ATS way before COVID, but there's almost like an over-reliance on them right now because they are receiving all these resumes and they need mechanisms that helps them sift through them to find the best likely match. And so you need to understand how they work so that you can I say, beat them. So I see sometimes some of you resorting to some really, tricky, graphic-y resumes. And unless you are pursuing a job into graphics, that's really a bad idea for most of you, because AT systems, application tracking systems, cannot read columns, cannot read graphics, and all of a sudden your beautifully appearing resume is absolutely unusable. Okay, so don't let it happen to you. Also, being able to understand how PDFs are read versus, a Word document, that type of thing. Oops. And we talked about the importance of crafting tailored cover letters, not just the cover letters that you send for every employer, but a cover letter that shows that you have at least a basic understanding for that particular industry, for that particular organization, and not just industry. We talked about the importance of developing a professional community, and you need to be organized. If you put together a nice broad search, if you don't stay organized, it will be next to impossible to remember who you have already contacted, who you need to follow up with, what kind of positions are supposed to be open when. So you need to have a mechanism to do that. And of course, when it comes to interviewing, you need to understand that there's not just like one way to interview. Different industries will resort to different interviewing formats, such as behavioral, situational, case interviews, technical interviews. So understanding what to expect is key to know on how to prepare. But how do you prepare? I already alluded to some of the international student resources. I'm not going to take time to go over that before, but in that particular page, you will see tips for resumes and cover letters and interviews that are specific to you all. Couple of resources that I would like to highlight. After you put together a resume, you can use VMock, this one here, to get some instant feedback on your resume, which is great because you can do it as many times as you like. You don't need to feel embarrassed if that's your first draft that you're not sure how it's gonna look like. Targeted resume is the same, but works a little different because you can upload not only your resume, but also the job description for the job that you are applying. And it will tell you how well that resume will work, will answer, how likely it is to fit the job description. I wanted to share some resources so that you understood how ATS work. And then there are also some non-academic job search resources for PhDs, the Lingual Language Institute, and the availability of practice interviews. Maybe one thing that I want to highlight, remember before I said something about it's so important that you stay organized. I'll show you one of my favorite documents, U.S. job search. Okay, spreadsheet to track everything in your job search. It's a great tool to be able to keep track of, and you can adapt that to anything that works for you, but it's a good tool to keep you on track and to know when you need to follow up with whom. And so that you know, for interviews, we afford students the opportunity to conduct a mock interview with one of our career coaches, and we provide feedback. Of course, these days, the interaction will be virtual, but most likely, even your interview for your real job is going to be virtual these days. So we will be able to provide feedback not only on your delivery, but also on your virtual present. And finally, it comes to the execution time. Remember when I said you're the only one that can do this? If you're gonna wait to have time to conduct your job search, it's never gonna happen. You need to treat it almost as a class, a class that meets 2 or 3 times a week, where you actually block time in your schedule to research employers, to look at job postings, to make connections, just to keep that fire burning. One of the biggest mistakes that I see in all students is that they have this ideal employer that they want to work with. And they put, are you familiar with the expression? They put all their eggs in that basket. They put all their hopes and dreams in that particular employer, and they're gonna wait to hear from that employer until they do anything else. Can you imagine if that employer never gets back with them? You will be stuck. Since here I'm in the mood for a metaphor, I want you to think of a big fire. You never let a big fire extinguish, right? You always continue to throw logs in that fire. I hope that some of you have been doing some bonfires these days, maybe do some marshmallows, roast some sausages, whatever works for you. But the idea here is that you are in continuing job searching mode. You don't wait to hear from someone before you pursue something else. It's only by doing that, by continuing to send out feelers, that you enhance your chances of actually hearing back from someone. And also taking the time to readjust your approach. You may find that you're not hearing back from anyone, and that could be due to a number of reasons. It could be due to the fact that maybe your resume isn't up to par, or you're not looking at the right places, or your approach may be too passive or too aggressive. Whatever the case may be, having touch points along the way to reevaluate your approach and to adjust this is key to success. I also would say remain flexible and please be open to possibilities. Okay, you can tell from this accent, I'm not from here. I came to this country, I pursued my education in a different country, and I had a certain idea of what I wanted to pursue and how I wanted to put my degree to good use. To be perfectly honest, career counseling, it was a second career for me. But for where I was in the United States, there weren't just a lot of opportunities to pursue that. And if you're curious, I used to work for the American Embassy in Rome. All my training was in diplomatic interactions, trading agreements, and because of life circumstances, I landed in a rural part of America. Needless to say, not a lot of job opportunities for someone like me. So I had to recycle myself professionally. And while I may have not grown up thinking when I grow up, I want to be a career counselor, I can tell you that 30 years later, I found a new love. And it's not something that I necessarily planned on, but being able to stay open to possibilities, and it's crucial, especially as an international student. What does it mean being open to possibilities? The next time that you are at a job fair, virtual or not, don't just look up 2 organizations. Of course, yes, see who's receptive to hiring international students, but keep an open mind, see what they have to offer. Don't be so, how can I say, firm in that idea that it prevents you from exploring other avenues. This is also the time, of course, as you conduct your search, to be very familiar with salary negotiation techniques, to review the work authorization rules, because as you get closer to that stage, you need to be able to articulate to your employer how things work. But also be sure to develop a parallel plan, whether it is in your home country and globally, because you need to maximize your chances for success at the end of the degree. And success may look in different ways. It doesn't necessarily have to look in a certain way. And real quickly here, some relevant resources. We talked about continuing your connections with U of M alumni through UCAN, through LinkedIn. For your global search, there is a section in the international, resource section of the UCC website that deals with both articles, job boards, and resources that can help you with that endeavor. Places like My Visa Jobs, Going Global can be particularly helpful in help you understand what are, for example, the organizations who have hired H-1B visa students before. Those may be good companies to target. And of course, I provided some additional resources for salary negotiation. Glassdoor is great to understand and to sort of right size your salary expectations. So as we summarize this, my advice to you is to make sure that you start your search, not just diving into the next job board, but really by taking a step back to know yourself, know your assets, and being crystal clear about what you're looking for. And if you need to review online materials, join blogs, we talked about Vault, ONET, looking at different resources, taking a career assessment tool to help you with that, please do that. Learn more about the job market. Don't be afraid to ask questions of your partners in International Center, in the Our Career Center, and other career center when you have any questions about cultural norms, professional and business etiquette. Develop appropriate job and internship search materials, but then put them to good use. Just the most wonderful resume is not going to do anything if you don't share it with your professional network, and if you don't continue to share it and send it just to keep the fire burning. And at the same time, as you plan for U.S. job search, be sure to also think of whether you want to call it a plan B, alternate plans, but just something that is going to position you to achieve success. And of course, before I pass the microphone here to my colleagues, I want to send you my best wishes for a successful job search. Take care.
Thank you so much, Mariella, for this rich presentation and so much information, resources as well. And thank you for emphasizing on, prepare a tailored resume. Right now, our office is going through a search for a position. I think both John and I have served on the search committee in the past. Is really when you have hundreds of applications to review, things is really stands out are those tailored resume and cover letter. And also the importance of doing mock interviews. I remember I did it as when I was international students, and then the counselor gave me a lot of feedback. So all those are helpful. And also thank you for pointing out at each college and school here on campus, they have their own career offices like engineering, ECRC, Ross, and also LSNA, the hub as well. So now I'm going to transition to my colleague, John Prescott, and he will be talking from the immigration perspective, which is an important component of this workshop as well. So let me share my screen. Okay, John, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Kate. And thank you, Mariella. I have to say, this is one of my favorite workshops of the year. Of course, this year, and this particular workshop has a new spin on it with our new platform. But I find the advice of Mariella and her colleagues in the Career Center and really the career advisors across all the different schools and colleges at the university just have a wonderful wealth of resources and the advice on kind of the thought process and the strategy and the mentality of the job search in the U.S. These lessons are, many of them are the same things I experienced in my job search process, and really some wonderful tips. As Kate mentioned, my role today, this afternoon with you, is to dive into some of the details. It is going to be brief in terms of, we're going to discuss a few different topics related to F and J work authorization. You could really take a deep dive into any of these work authorization categories for much longer. However, I wanted to make sure to complement Mariella's comments with making sure that you have some basic information, equip yourself with some basic knowledge of what you need to know to get started. And then from there, when appropriate in the job search, you can educate yourself in a more deep way on these different topics. Most of today's workshop is focused on your job search, maybe towards the very end of your degree or launching your career after your degree is finished. However, I do want to, of course, reference the fact that there are employment options for international students before graduation. And that's very important. That can help develop your professional network. It can help you obtain strong letters of recommendation, build your resume, build your CV, many things that will assist you later on and after graduation. So as an F or J international student, you have the ability to pursue on-campus employment. That is a benefit of your immigration status and does not require an extensive immigration process. In fact, for F1s, there is no advance authorization or paperwork. For J1 students, there's a one-page simple form that you complete with your supervisor and submit to the front desk of the International Center or email to icenter@umich.edu. So very simple benefit of your status. CPT and OPT are both options for F1 students before graduation. I will say OPT is primarily used for students after graduation. We're going to discuss that more. CPT is traditionally what F1 students use to pursue internships, work, or training that is directly related to their major field of study during their program. In other words, CPT would be available before completing your degree. CPT is not relevant after your degree is completed. Finally, for J1 students, there's a category of work authorization called academic training. And that is a process, it's actually for J1 students both before and after graduation. Kate, if you want to go ahead and go to the next slide. For after graduation, I mentioned academic training applies to J1 students, and optional practical training, or OPT, is the employment option leveraging or using continuing your F1 status after graduation. So real big picture, if you're an international student with an F1 or J1 status, the way the regulations are written, there are limitations on what you can do for work. In other words, entering the U.S. with an F1 or J1 student status does not permit you to work anywhere doing anything for any amount of time. There are specific rules and regulations and limitations. So thinking about the employment options before graduation. On-campus employment, you're limited to the number of hours is the primary limitation. And then after graduation, we're going to dive primarily, the focus of today is on these categories, OPT and academic training, before I hand it over to my colleague Beth to talk a little bit more about H-1B. And we're happy to answer questions, as Kate mentioned at the end. Go ahead and skip to the next. So I'm not sure, normally when we do this in person, I'll ask students to raise their hand if there's anyone here in J1 status. But in recognition, we have a really robust audience, which is outstanding for this presentation, and the fact that we'll be recording for future viewing. I think it would be fine to cover this maybe briefly. For J1 students, I mentioned you do have the option to work on campus during your program. There is some paperwork on our website to fill out and submit to our office. Now for off-campus work, this could be a summer internship or an off-campus employment, something that is directly related to your major field of study. That's a theme you're going to start hearing for the remainder of the presentation. Pretty much anything off campus, if you're an F or a J international student, has to be directly related to your major. So for J1 students to gain experience off campus, the category of work authorization is called academic training. It's very similar to do before or after completion of studies. It's pretty much the same application process. The length of time is typically up to 18 months. That's in the federal regulations for the J1 category, is a maximum of 18 months. However, there's a specific exception allowed for doctoral students. If you complete a PhD and your overall period of study was equal to or greater than 36 months, you may qualify for an additional 18 months. Again, that's for PhD graduates only. In general, you cannot exceed the amount of time spent in your course of study with academic training. So even though there's 18 months generally possible, I work with the law school, for example, and they have an 8-month master's degree called the LLM program. Well, if your program is 8 months, then the duration of academic training cannot exceed 8 months. In terms of the application process, one thing that's great about academic training is you don't have to actually apply with the U.S. government. In other words, you're not going to submit any application forms or fees or paperwork to the U.S. government. Instead, we, as your J1 program sponsor, are authorized to review and approve academic training fully. We would issue a new DS 2019 form and an academic training permission or authorization letter. So visit our website for more information if you're a J1 student and want to review the forms or other application instructions related to academic training. And now let's talk more about OPT for F1 students. So OPT, I find in my work, a lot of F1 students have heard of OPT. Maybe they've used OPT for a prior degree in the US, if this isn't your first degree. But this is primarily used by F1 students to work after graduation. We have around 8,000, give or take, F1 status holders, and 99% of OPT is used by students after graduation. Once in a while, if for some reason a student cannot use CPT to work before graduation, there is something called pre-completion OPT, but it's so uncommon, I'm really not going to discuss it and instead focus on post-completion OPT and STEM extension OPT. So post-completion OPT is the 12-month authorization for all majors that would immediately follow your last semester of enrollment in your program of study. The application process, there is a process. I mean, it takes some time, and it takes some time both to kind of get used to the steps, as well as primarily when I say it takes time, you're looking at from start to finish, from the time you decide I'm going to apply for OPT to the time you get approval, potentially 4 or 5 months. So advanced planning is very important. There are more steps than are indicated on our slide here, but roughly speaking, the first step for someone in their final semester of study who's looking at applying for post-completion OPT would be to take an online training that we've developed and is available and linked on the International Center website. You would then begin to gather information and documents so that you can complete steps 3 and 4. Step 3 would be requesting a new I-20 from the International Center. You cannot apply for OPT unless and until you get a new I-20 from our office. So it's very important that you recognize and build in a couple of weeks, at least a couple of weeks, to allow for requesting and receiving a new I-20. And then actually a next step separate from your new I-20 is collecting documents, creating an application packet, and then mailing that to the U.S. government. So when we create an I-20, it's called an OPT endorsed or an OPT recommended I-20. It's us as your F1 advisors saying, we believe this student qualifies and we recommend approval. But the actual application is both mailed and reviewed by the U.S. government, specifically USCIS. A job offer is not necessary in order to complete any of these application steps and is not a criteria for qualifying. You can apply for OPT with or without a job offer and be approved with or without a job offer. I put on the bottom cost. Normally there's a dollar figure. However, the application fees are under review right now. In fact, they were all set to be increased, but that was put on hold. So for right now, when you're getting ready to apply, or a year from now or 2 years from now, wherever your timing is, keep in mind that check at the time that you're going to file your application what the accurate fee is at that time, because they are subject to change. This is my favorite slide and really represents so much of what we do in our daily work as international student advisors. I love diving into this with students when they're, ideally this is a conversation to have when you're just about to start or maybe have recently started your last semester on campus, potentially even before that. There are 2 main strategy questions related to post-completion OPT. And these are the questions that the procedure, there's steps involved, but applying for OPT ultimately is not that complicated as long as you take some time to flow through all of the details. But the strategy for OPT are really in these 2 questions. When are you going to file your application with USCIS? Meaning, what I mean with that language is, when are you going to receive your new I-20, collect all the paperwork you need for your application packet, and mail it to USCIS? You can do that as early as 90 days before you finish your last semester, or you could even do it up to 60 days after your I-20 completion date. We don't recommend typically waiting until after your I-20 completion date. That 60-day period is referred to as your F1 grace period, but it is possible. So part of your strategy here with filing when to file is If you're in, let's say, the later stages of your job search and have an offer or feel that you may be receiving an offer, then you might, in theory, you could wait to find out exactly when, which company is giving you an offer, when you and they would like the position to begin. So some students like to have clarity, if possible, on when they want to start their work before setting actually the second question, the requested start date. But where you are in your job search process can inform when you decide to file your application. Remember, when figuring out when you're going to file your application, no matter if you file 90 days before or up to 60 days after, that does not change the processing time that USCIS uses. It will still take them anywhere from, well, right now, 3 months, 3.5 months, 4 months, 4.5 months. Our students are getting application processing times all across the spectrum. Occasionally it's quicker, 2.5 months, but 4 months or even a little longer is not unusual at all. So keep that in mind in terms of, in general, I do recommend applying earlier in your application window, but not too early. Kate's heard me say this. If you apply on 91 days, they will reject your application. So do not apply too early. We have some students every year who want to be perfect and will mail their sort of packet on the 92nd day thinking, well, I can get it there exactly on 90th day. And then UPS or FedEx did too good of a job shipping. It arrived 91 day, application rejected. USCIS took 6 weeks to return the application rejected. Now you have to get a new I-20. Now you have to restart, refile, and you've lost 2 months. So if you're ready to go at the earliest, aim for around 85, 86 days is my advice. The second strategy question, what requested OPT start date to use? So you can request your OPT to start as early as 1 day after your I-20 completion or as late as 59 days after your I-20 completion. Winter is a super common, very common semester for graduation. Certainly we have many in the fall, but let's use winter as an example. If you graduate winter semester, your I-20 completion date will be April 30. If April 30 is your I-20 completion date, you could ask for OPT to start as early as May 1st or as late as June 29. If you ask for May 1st, you are indicating that you want your OPT to start, you want your work authorization to start as soon as possible after your I-20 finishes. Of course, requesting June 29 is the opposite. You want it to start as late as possible after your I-20 finishes. So just a couple quick comments before we move to the next slide. When it comes to strategy, I want you to keep in mind a couple of things. First, post-completion OPT permits up to, or the government permits up to 90 days of unemployment time during post-completion OPT. I'm going to say that again. You have up to 90 days unemployment time during post-completion OPT. So if you're in an earlier stage of your job search and maybe you don't yet have an offer, still apply, you still qualify for OPT, but maybe you'll pick not the earliest possible OPT start date. Maybe you want to pick something halfway through or 2/3 or 3/4 through your time range. So maybe you pick not May 1st, but maybe June 5th or June 15 or June 20. You would have that extra period of May and the early part of June to continue your job search, continue to hold a valid F1 status, but not accrue any days of unemployment time until you reach your start date. Alternatively, if you have a job offer or you want to start right away, then go for an earlier start date. It's really up to, well, it is up to you when to request your start date. The other thing to keep in mind with this question, you do have to think about this at the beginning of your application for OPT, because we have to print your requested dates when we create your OPT I-20. And once you mail your application to USCIS, you're locked in on those requested dates. They're not something that you can modify later on. Next slide, please. So I want to briefly mention the 24-month STEM extension. All majors, all F1 students from across campus, if you complete your bachelor's degree, your master's degree, your PhD, will apply for the 12-month post-completion. For some students, during those first 12 months, you may qualify to apply for the 24-month STEM extension. So again, everyone starts with 12 months, and then for some students, you may qualify to apply for an additional 24 months. It's very important to know, really look into this now, or when you're entering your post-completion OPT process, to try to determine, would I qualify for this STEM extension? Is this something that is an opportunity for me to leverage as I go through the job search process, and me to leverage as I hope to work in the US, not just maybe for 1 year, but maybe 3 years or more. So the first indication of if you do qualify or not is your major. And you actually want to look at page 1 of your I-20. Right in the middle, there's a numerical code called SIP code. And it should have 2 numbers, a dot, and then more numbers. That code is a classification system that the US government uses for a variety of reporting purposes. And the Department of Homeland Security decided to use that same coding to create an official list of STEM majors. Perhaps I should articulate STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, mathematics. But those are broad terms, and some are obvious. If you're, an electrical engineer, then obviously that fits. Other majors you might not be immediately sure if your major qualifies. Look at the code on page 1 of your I-20 and compare it to the official STEM list on the government's website. Even if your major is listed as STEM eligible, keep in mind that there are more types of, there are other things that are required to qualify for STEM OPT. And certainly, if you want to take a deeper dive into this topic, visit our website because it's detailed in a much greater kind of length. But another thing that I want to emphasize today, and to make sure you're aware of, and maybe you did or did not know, is to qualify for STEM OPT, your employer has to be a participant in something called E-Verify. E-Verify is, in most parts of the country, optional. So some employers will be enrolled in E-Verify, some won't. It's a kind of system for companies to verify the legal immigration status of their employees. So talk to your employer or potential employer if they participate. Their human resources office within the company should know if they're a participant in E-Verify. The other piece of the puzzle that I like to emphasize is called the Form I-983. It's the main form that a student combined with their employer would need to collaborate and co-write, complete in order for the student to qualify for STEM OPT. And it lists a variety of terms and conditions that the employer needs to agree to, as well as the student needs to agree to. And so I think it's important as you educate yourself about STEM OPT and think, you know, this might work for me. I would really emphasize looking at the I-983 form in addition to the other things I mentioned. Kate, I think there were some questions, and you can move to the next slide. I don't know, should we wait until, do you think after Beth?
Beth is here already, so let's go through the slides that Beth has prepared, and then we'll answer the questions. In the meanwhile, John, you feel free to see in the chat the question. So now we're going to transition to Beth Hoffman-Lopez. She is our faculty and staff immigration specialist. Give us a quick overview of H-1B and PR. Beth, I did mention about the H-1B workshop and PR workshop that will happen later this semester.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kate. Yes, I just wanted to go over the options beyond the OPT or some of the other work authorizations. And the most commonly used work authorization is the H-1B. The H-1B is for a specialty occupation, and for a position to be considered a specialty occupation, it must require a bachelor's degree or higher in a specialized field of study. And in order for a case to be filed, you must have the corresponding academic credentials that are required for the position. The H-1B is temporary, and by temporary, we mean it is good for, in general, up to 6 years. It can only be taken in 3-year increments at a time, but it can be extended beyond the 6th year for people who are in the permanent residency process. So those who are in the permanent residency process, if a case is filed before a person's end of the 5th year on the H-1B, then it can be extended beyond that 6 years to give a person time to complete the permanent residency process. The H-1B is an employer-based petition, so it's the employer that makes the application to the USCIS. John talked about how with the OPT, it's you as the student who would be filling out the application and submitting a petition, but in this case, it's employer-sponsored, so it's the employer who must file a petition on your behalf. Large employers, many of them will have in-house counsel or specialists who will file these cases on your behalf. Smaller firms may hire outside immigration attorneys to file these cases for them. Now, the H-1B is both employer and job specific. So when a specific employer sponsors you, but they also have to list the job in the application so that once you have an H-1B, if there are any changes to your job, if you get a promotion, the employer may have to file what's called an H-1B amendment because the H-1B is job specific. So any changes may require the filing of a new petition. The H-1B employment can be part-time or full-time. You can also hold work authorization with several H-1B employers. You can have concurrent employment. So as long as both employers sponsor an H-1B on your behalf, then you can work for both employers. Also, once you obtain an H-1B, if you change employers, the new employer just has to file an application on your behalf, and then you can transfer to the new employer once they have the filing fee receipt. You don't actually have to wait for an approval notice before starting with that employer. Now, the H-1B goes through several government agencies, and the first one is the U.S. Department of Labor. So when a employer is filing a case on your behalf, they will have to gather all the information, first of all, from you. So they'll get copies of all your documents showing your status, your I-94, copy of the passport, your visa stamp, as well as your I-20s or DS 2019s. They will then work with the Department of Labor. They first have to get what's called a wage determination. So the employer must attest to the Department of Labor that they are paying 100% of the prevailing or actual wage, whichever is higher. Now, the prevailing wage is an average wage for that position in the geographic area where the position is being sponsored. And then the actual wage are just the wages of similarly employed employees at that firm. So the employer must either through the Department of Labor or using the Department of Labor's online system determine the prevailing wage. They must then get their internal documentation to show what the actual wage for that position is. And then they will attest to the Department of Labor that here's the wage that they're offering, and it does meet both the prevailing and actual wage for the position. So once the employer gets that information, they will file that application with the Department of Labor, and it takes about a week to get a certified LCA. You'll notice on the timeline, we say 2 to 13 weeks to do this, and this is because some employers go through the Department of Labor to get that determination done for the prevailing wage, and the Department of Labor can take 3 to 4 months to do that. If the employer does it on their own using the Department of Labor's online wage library, then it can be done very quickly. So it just depends on what the procedure is for that employer. Once they get back a certified LCA, the labor condition application, they can then file the paperwork with the USCIS. Employment-based cases go through the California Service Center, and it can be adjudicated in either 2 weeks to 4 months or greater. Currently, it's taking about 4 months, but we've seen it take up to 9 months to a year, just depending on the time of year and their workload. The 2 weeks is because there is a premium processing option. So the employer can pay extra to get the case adjudicated in 2 weeks. Now, the premium processing time frame currently is 15 calendar days, but they are about to change that, and it'll be 15 business days. So basically, it'll go from 2 to 3 weeks once that change is put in place. Now, you've probably heard that there is a cap on the number of H-1Bs that are given out every year. And so those start with the government's fiscal year. The government's fiscal year runs October 1st through September 30th of the following year. And during that time, there are 65,000 H-1Bs given out, plus an additional 20,000 for those who have received a master's degree or higher here in the U.S. Now, an employer cannot file more than 6 months in advance of the start date. And so since the government's fiscal year starts on October 1st, April 1st is when employers can start filing. This past year, they had a new system. Instead of everybody sending in applications and them receiving all this mail, they now have employers put prospective employees' name into the system, a database, and then the USCIS runs a lottery system, selects the names of those people that will be considered for H-1Bs, notify the employer that their person has been selected, and then the employer can send in the documentation. There are some employers that are not subject to that numerical limitation, and those include institutions of higher education, certain nonprofits, and government research institutes. So anything that is not under that exception, then they are subject to the cap, and then they will have, you'll have to follow the numbers for the government's fiscal year. Some people ask, can I skip OPT and go straight to H-1B? And yes, you can. If you qualify, if you have the degree for the position, you can do that. But we recommend that you apply for the OPT. If your name is not selected for that year's cap, if you have your OPT, you have that work authorization. If you're eligible for the STEM, you even have a longer period, and that way the employer can put your name in multiple times in case you are not selected in that first cap try. Okay, so we always recommend that you apply for that OPT. But there's no reason why, if you're qualified at the time that the cap is being run, the lottery, that they couldn't try and do that right away. Okay. There are some, just one note, if you are on the J1 and subject to the 2-year home residency requirement, you do have to fulfill that requirement or get it waived before an H-1B can be filed on your behalf. There are some other options for people, for those people from Mexico or Canada. There are the trade NAFTA, the TN category, and there's a list of certain occupations that qualify for that. So if anybody's from Mexico or TN, they can use potentially that as another option. There's also the E3 category specifically for Australians. It follows the H-1B in that the employer must do a labor condition application using the prevailing and actual wage. Those are good for 2 years and renewable after that. So there are a few options, but they are more limiting. I also will go to questions at the end, but I'm also just going to give a brief introduction to the permanent residency process. This only covers employment-based permanent residency and not anything else such as family-based. So employment-based permanent residency can take many years to process. So if you have a job and the employers want to extend your work authorization beyond what the H-1B would allow, that 6 years, they can sponsor you for permanent residency. This process can be employer and job specific, just like the H-1B. Most cases follow a 3-stage process. There it goes through the Department of Labor and through the USCIS. That first step is for the labor certification, and this is where the employer must run a test of the job market. So an employer will advertise the position to see if there are any U.S. workers minimally qualified, willing, and able to take that position. Now, if a employer runs that labor test and they do obtain resumes for qualified U.S. workers who would be willing to take the job, it does not mean that you would be kicked out of your job. What it means is that they've run this test of the labor market. There are U.S. workers, so there's no need for an employer to sponsor a foreign national because there are U.S. workers for that job. And you could still continue working under your H-1B until the end of your time allotted. So if the employer does run this test of the job market and there are no qualified U.S. workers who apply, then the Department of Labor will certify those results, and then the position and then the process can proceed to the second step. That first stage can take 6 to 18 months just because the employer has to go through the recruitment process and then file the case with the Department of Labor. They take about 4 to 5 months or so to certify those results, and then it can move to the next stage, which is the immigrant petition to the USCIS, the I-140. And the I-140 usually takes about 2 weeks to 7 months or so. The 2 weeks, once again, because there is a premium processing option, it will be 15 calendar days soon, but at this time it's 2 weeks. So those 2 stages are handled by the employer. The third stage of the process is called the adjustment of status, and that's when the focus of this process turns to your background. Do you have a criminal history or any reason why we would want to keep you from becoming a U.S. permanent resident? To file the last stage, you must be eligible. The U.S. only gives out a certain number of immigrant visas per year, and it's restricted to no more than 7% to natives from any one country. So as you can imagine, if you're from Iceland, there aren't that many people coming from there. You'll just kind of go through the process and can file that adjustment of status right away. If you're from a country where we have a large number of immigrants coming from, China and India are the two most, the countries that we get the most people from, then you will have to wait to file until an immigrant number becomes available. And an immigrant number is determined by the date on which the process was first filed with the government. So in this three-stage process where there's a stage one, the labor certification, the day that is filed with the Department of Labor basically locks in your place in line. So you can always know what your priority date and when you can file that last stage based on when a case is first filed. There is a two-stage process, so it doesn't always go through that first labor certification stage. There are two categories where no labor certificate is needed, and those are for the people with extraordinary ability, outstanding professor researchers, and those who are doing work in the national interest. So for those categories, it kind of skips step one. That doesn't make it easier per se, because of course, given the titles, you know, extraordinary, outstanding, you do have to show that your work meets that criteria. So most people, you have to have at least 3 years in the field, which makes sense because you need time to build up your resume to show how your work is outstanding. You can do it by showing prizes awarded in the field. These would not include student prizes, but anything that has more of a larger outreach, like national, international. Things such as membership in organizations that require outstanding achievement by their members, so not just a dues-paying organization. They would look at your publications, the journals that they're published in, the impact factor, and just other professionals attesting to the outstanding nature of your work. So for the people who fall into that category, that would start with the I-140 stage, and all this information would be submitted to back up the fact that your work is either extraordinary, outstanding, or in the national interest. People who go through those categories, there tends to be a shorter wait to file the adjustment of status, but there are occasional waits on those categories as well to file that last stage. People who file that last stage, spouses can then apply for work authorization, and also there is a work authorization at that point for anybody who has an approved I-140. Their spouses can also apply for a special H-4 work authorization. So once you get to that final stage, there is that employment authorization while the process is completing. I guess that's my quick overview. I saw some questions coming up, so we can probably get to some of those with everyone.
Yes, one question, I'm gonna stop sharing and also stop recording as well. One question is, somebody asked, Beth, since you went through H-1B, does one need H-1B in order to work in the space sector?
In the space sector specifically? Well, the H-1B is the most commonly used visa. I mean, there's